The morning sun cast long shadows across the ancient stones of Windsor Castle as King Charles III stood at his study window, contemplating a decision that would echo through centuries of British history. In his hands, he held a carefully crafted letter bearing the papal seal, an invitation that no British monarch had ever accepted in over 400 years. The weight of tradition pressed heavily upon his shoulders. Since Henry VIII's dramatic break with Rome in 1534, British royalty and the Catholic Church had maintained a relationship marked by careful distance and diplomatic politeness. Yet here was Charles, considering something his predecessors would have found unthinkable, joining Pope Francis in prayer at St. Peter's Basilica. The idea had been percolating for months. It began with quiet conversations between the Archbishop of Canterbury and Vatican officials, discussions about healing old wounds and building bridges in an increasingly divided world. The Pope himself had extended the invitation during a private audience with British diplomats, speaking of his desire to unite Christian voices in addressing global challenges like climate change, poverty, and religious persecution. Charles had always been a man of deep faith and progressive thinking. Throughout his decades as heir apparent, he had championed interfaith dialogue and environmental stewardship, causes that aligned closely with Pope Francis's own mission. The king saw this not as a betrayal of Anglican tradition, but as an opportunity to demonstrate that faith could transcend institutional boundaries. The decision wasn't made lightly. Charles convened countless meetings with his closest advisors, church officials, and constitutional experts. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, initially expressed reservations, but eventually came to support the king's vision. "Your Majesty," Welby had said during one particularly intense discussion, "perhaps it is time for the crown to lead by example in showing that Christian unity need not threaten our distinct traditions." Opposition voices were swift and vocal. Conservative members of Parliament questioned the constitutional implications. Protestant organizations expressed outrage at what they saw as a betrayal of Reformation principles. Social media erupted with heated debates about royal authority and religious sovereignty. Some called it a publicity stunt, others a dangerous precedent. Yet Charles remained resolute. He had witnessed firsthand the power of symbolic gestures during his years as Prince of Wales. He remembered the impact of his mother's historic handshake with Sinn Féin leader Martin McGuinness, and how small acts of reconciliation could shift entire political landscapes. This moment felt equally transformative. The king's private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, worked tirelessly to navigate the complex logistics and protocol requirements. Every detail had to be perfect, from the order of procession to the specific prayers that would be shared. The Vatican proved remarkably accommodating, understanding that this was as much about diplomatic breakthrough as spiritual communion. Security concerns added another layer of complexity. Both Buckingham Palace and Vatican officials worked closely with international intelligence agencies to ensure the safety of both leaders. The symbolic power of the moment made it a potential target for extremist groups from various religious and political backgrounds. As news of the planned meeting began to leak to the press, public opinion surveys revealed a nation deeply divided. Younger Britons generally supported the king's initiative, viewing it as a progressive step toward global unity. Older generations remained skeptical, concerned about constitutional precedents and religious implications. Charles spent hours studying the historical context, reading accounts of Henry VIII's break with Rome and the subsequent centuries of Catholic-Protestant tension in Britain. He consulted with historians, theologians, and constitutional scholars, seeking to understand the full weight of what he was proposing. The king's decision was also deeply personal. His own spiritual journey had been marked by curiosity about different faith traditions. He had long admired the Dalai Lama, maintained friendships with Muslim leaders, and expressed appreciation for various Christian denominations beyond Anglicanism. This ecumenical approach reflected his belief that royal leadership should embrace rather than divide. Queen Camilla proved to be one of his strongest supporters. During private conversations, she reminded him of his mother's legacy of service and duty suggesting that Queen Elizabeth II would have understood the importance of adapting royal traditions to serve contemporary needs. "The monarchy has survived by evolving," she told him, "not by remaining rigid." The international community watched with intense interest. European monarchs, many of whom maintained closer relationships with the Vatican, privately encouraged Charles's initiative. President Biden, himself a Catholic, expressed support for the historic meeting through diplomatic channels. As the date approached, Charles found himself reflecting on the nature of leadership itself. The crown came with enormous privilege, but also with the responsibility to guide the nation through challenging times. Britain faced significant challenges: economic uncertainty, social division, and questions about its role in a rapidly changing world. Perhaps this gesture of reconciliation and unity could help heal some of these deeper wounds. The king's faith had always been central to his identity. Unlike some monarchs who viewed religious duties as mere ceremony, Charles genuinely believed in the power of prayer and spiritual reflection. The opportunity to join with Pope Francis, a man he deeply respected for his commitment to social justice and environmental protection, felt like a natural extension of his own values. Religious leaders across Britain began to weigh in publicly. While some Anglican bishops expressed concerns about theological implications, others saw the meeting as an opportunity to strengthen Christian witness in an increasingly secular society. Catholic leaders in Britain were unanimous in their support, viewing it as long overdue recognition of their community's loyalty to the crown. The media attention intensified as the Vatican confirmed the meeting's details. International news outlets described it as potentially the most significant moment in British royal history since the coronation. Religious scholars debated the theological implications, while political analysts examined the constitutional ramifications. Charles maintained his regular schedule of royal duties while preparing for the historic encounter, but those close to him noticed a particular intensity in his demeanor. He spent additional time in private prayer and consultation with spiritual advisors, understanding that he was about to cross a threshold that would fundamentally alter the relationship between the British crown and the Catholic Church. The weight of 4 centuries of history pressed upon this single decision, yet Charles felt increasingly certain that it was the right path forward. In a world torn by division and conflict, perhaps it was time for ancient enemies to become partners in the cause of peace and human dignity. The ancient bells of Westminster Abbey chimed 7 times as King Charles III motorcade departed from Buckingham Palace, beginning a journey that would take him from the heart of Anglican Britain to the center of Catholic Christianity. The route through London's streets was lined with crowds, their faces reflecting the nation's divided emotions about this unprecedented royal pilgrimage. Inside the royal Bentley, Charles reviewed his notes one final time. The prayer service had been carefully crafted through weeks of diplomatic and theological negotiation. Vatican officials and Anglican representatives had worked together to create a ceremony that honored both traditions without compromising either faith's core beliefs. The king would participate as a fellow Christian, not as a convert or theological subordinate. The flight from Heathrow to Rome's Fiumicino Airport took just over 2 hours, but it carried the weight of centuries. British monarchs had traveled to the continent countless times for state visits, diplomatic missions, and personal holidays, but none had ever journeyed to Rome with the express purpose of joining the Pope in prayer. The cabin crew, handpicked for their discretion, maintained professional composure despite the historic nature of their passengers' mission. Upon landing in Rome, Charles was greeted by Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Vatican's Secretary of State, and British Ambassador to Italy, Edward Llewellyn. The diplomatic protocol was intricate, balancing Charles's status as both a foreign head of state and a fellow Christian leader. Italian authorities provided security, while Vatican Swiss guards prepared for the most significant royal visitor in their organization's modern history. The king's accommodation at the British Embassy residence provided a quiet space for final preparations. Charles spent the evening in private reflection, reading from both Anglican and Catholic devotional texts. He had brought with him a personal copy of the Book of Common Prayer, gifted to him by his mother, alongside a translation of papal encyclicals that had influenced his thinking on social justice and environmental stewardship. Meanwhile, St. Peter's Basilica buzzed with unprecedented activity. Vatican staff worked through the night to prepare the sacred space for a ceremony unlike any in recent memory. The altar was adorned with flowers from both British and Italian gardens, symbolizing the growth of understanding between the two Christian traditions. Special seating arrangements accommodated the unique protocol requirements of hosting a reigning monarch who is also the head of another Christian church. News outlets from around the world descended upon Rome. The Vatican press office, typically accustomed to managing coverage of papal activities, found itself coordinating with British royal correspondents, constitutional experts, and religious scholars. The story dominated headlines from London to Sydney, from New York to Lagos, as the global community tried to grasp the significance of this moment. Pope Francis himself had spent considerable time preparing for the encounter. Born Jorge Mario Bergoglio in Argentina, he had long admired the British monarchy's evolution from absolute rule to constitutional service. The Pope saw in Charles a kindred spirit committed to addressing climate change, poverty, and social justice through moral leadership rather than political power. The morning of the historic meeting dawned clear and crisp. Charles began his day with private prayers in the embassy chapel, reflecting on the long journey that had brought him to this moment. His breakfast included simple fare, remembering Pope Francis's preference for humility over ostentation. The king had specifically requested that the day's events reflect the values of service and simplicity that both leaders championed. Security arrangements required unprecedented coordination between British protection officers, Italian police, Vatican Swiss guards, and international intelligence agencies. The route from the British Embassy to Vatican City was secured with military precision, yet efforts were made to allow public viewing of this historic procession. Crowds began gathering in St. Peter's Square before dawn. Catholics, Anglicans, and curious observers from many faiths came to witness history in the making. Italian vendors sold souvenirs hastily created for the occasion, while tour guides struggled to explain to visitors the full significance of what they were about to witness. The king's arrival at the Vatican was marked by ceremonies steeped in both tradition and innovation. Swiss guards presented arms as Charles stepped from his vehicle, their colorful Renaissance uniforms providing a striking backdrop to the modern diplomatic breakthrough. Cardinal Parolin escorted the king through the ancient corridors of the Apostolic Palace, past frescoes and sculptures that had witnessed centuries of European political and religious drama. Pope Francis waited in his private study, a simple room that reflected his commitment to humble service. The two men's first meeting was private, lasting nearly 30 minutes. Neither the Vatican nor Buckingham Palace would reveal details of their conversation, but witnesses reported an immediate warmth between the leaders. They discussed their shared concerns about global inequality, environmental destruction, and religious persecution. The Pope had prepared a special gift for the king, a hand-carved olive wood cross from the Holy Land, representing the peace that both leaders hoped to promote through their meeting. Charles reciprocated with a first edition of one of his own books on environmental stewardship, personally inscribed with gratitude for the Pope's leadership on climate issues. As they prepared to move to St. Peter's Basilica, both men paused at a window overlooking the square below. Thousands of people had gathered, representing dozens of nationalities and Christian denominations. The sight reinforced their shared conviction that this moment transcended politics and protocol, touching something deeper about humanity's longing for unity and understanding. The procession to the Basilica followed ancient Vatican protocol while accommodating Charles's unique status. He walked alongside Pope Francis, neither ahead nor behind, symbolizing their equality as Christian leaders despite their different roles. The Swiss Guard provided ceremonial escort, while British protection officers maintained discreet security positions. Inside St. Peter's Basilica, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. The gathered congregation included cardinals, Anglican bishops, diplomatic representatives, and carefully selected lay faithful from both traditions. Many wept openly at the sight of the British king and the Pope walking together beneath Michelangelo's dome, understanding that they were witnessing the healing of wounds centuries in the making. The service itself was carefully structured to honor both Anglican and Catholic traditions. Readings came from scriptures both churches shared, while prayers focused on themes of unity, peace, and service to humanity's most vulnerable members. Neither leader compromised their theological positions, yet both demonstrated that difference need not mean division. Charles later described the moment of silent prayer alongside Pope Francis as profoundly moving. Standing before the tomb of St. Peter, both men reflected on the call to servant leadership that had shaped their respective roles. The king found himself thinking of his mother's lifetime of service, while the Pope contemplated the evangelical mission that had driven him from Argentina to the Vatican. The musical selections blended Anglican and Catholic traditions, with choirs from both Westminster Abbey and the Sistine Chapel participating. The harmonies that filled the ancient basilica seemed to symbolize the possibility of unity despite difference, of cooperation transcending centuries of separation. As the formal service concluded, Charles and Pope Francis exchanged what observers described as a meaningful embrace. In that moment, the weight of history seemed to lift, replaced by hope for a future where Christian churches could work together to address humanity's greatest challenges while maintaining their distinctive traditions and beliefs. The golden afternoon light streaming through St. Peter's magnificent windows cast ethereal patterns across the basilica floor as King Charles III and Pope Francis concluded their historic prayer service. The moment that followed would be remembered as equally significant as the ceremony itself. Their joint address to the world, delivered from the papal balcony overlooking the square packed with thousands of witnesses to this unprecedented reconciliation. Standing side by side on the famous balcony where popes traditionally deliver their most important messages, Charles and Francis presented a powerful image of Christian unity. The king, resplendent in a simple dark suit adorned only with the Order of the Garter, stood beside the Pope in his traditional white cassock. Their positioning was carefully arranged to emphasize equality rather than hierarchy, two servants of God addressing the faithful as equals in mission, if not in theology. Pope Francis spoke first, his words carried by loudspeakers across the square and broadcast live to a global audience estimated at over 1 billion viewers. Speaking in multiple languages, Italian, English, Spanish, and French, the Pope emphasized that their meeting represented not political maneuvering, but authentic Christian witness to the possibility of reconciliation and cooperation. Today we demonstrate that the love of Christ transcends the boundaries we have created, the Pope declared, his voice strong despite his advanced years. The King of England and the Bishop of Rome stand together not because we have erased our differences, but because we have chosen to let our shared commitment to justice, peace, and care for creation unite us in service to all humanity. When Charles stepped forward to address the crowd, his words carried the weight of 4 centuries of separation and the hope of a new beginning. Speaking with the measured dignity that marked his public appearances, the king acknowledged the complexity of the moment while emphasizing its essential simplicity. I come here not as a conqueror or convert, but as a fellow follower of Jesus Christ who believes that our world's greatest challenges demand our church's greatest cooperation, Charles said, his voice echoing across the ancient stones. The threats to our planet, to human dignity, and to religious freedom cannot be met by any single faith tradition alone. We must work together, respecting our differences while celebrating our shared values. The crowd's response was thunderous. Catholics waved papal flags alongside Anglican banners, hastily improvised for the occasion. British tourists found themselves embracing Italian pilgrims, while clergy from various denominations wept openly at the spectacle of reconciliation unfolding before them. Following their public address, Charles and Pope Francis retired to a private lunch that would later be described by participants as remarkably informal and warmly personal. The Pope had insisted on his customary simple meal, served in the papal apartment's modest dining room rather than in one of the Vatican's more elaborate reception halls. Their conversation ranged across topics, both profound and personal. They discussed their shared experiences of assuming leadership roles later in life, the challenges of balancing tradition with necessary change, and their mutual concern for the planet's environmental crisis. Charles shared his decades of environmental advocacy, while Pope Francis spoke passionately about his encyclical Laudato Si and the moral imperative to care for creation. The king was particularly struck by the Pope's stories of his ministry in Argentina's slums, where he had witnessed firsthand the impact of economic inequality and environmental degradation on the world's most vulnerable populations. In turn, Charles described his work with the Prince's Trust and his efforts to promote sustainable development in Commonwealth nations. Their theological differences were not ignored, but handled with mutual respect and intellectual honesty. Charles explained the Anglican commitment to episcopal governance and liturgical tradition, while Pope Francis outlined Catholic teaching on papal authority and apostolic succession. Rather than debating these differences, they explored how their churches could collaborate while maintaining their distinctive identities. The afternoon included a private tour of the Vatican museums, where the Pope personally guided Charles through treasures that told the story of Christianity's artistic and intellectual heritage. They paused particularly long at Renaissance masterpieces depicting biblical reconciliation scenes, finding contemporary relevance in ancient artistic expressions of forgiveness and unity. In the Sistine Chapel, beneath Michelangelo's awe-inspiring ceiling, both men stood in contemplative silence. Charles later reflected that the moment felt profoundly spiritual, transcending the artistic magnificence to touch something deeper about humanity's relationship with the divine. The Pope pointed out details in the frescoes that emphasized themes of redemption and new beginnings, drawing parallels to their own historic encounter. As evening approached, Charles and Pope Francis participated in Vespers, the traditional evening prayer service. This time, the service was private, attended only by close advisors and personal chaplains from both traditions. The intimate setting allowed for more personal reflection on the day's significance and its implications for future Christian cooperation. The Pope presented Charles with additional gifts during their private time together: a handwritten letter to be delivered to the Archbishop of Canterbury, expressing hopes for continued Anglican-Catholic dialogue, and a special rosary made from wood taken from a tree planted by St. Francis of Assisi. Charles reciprocated with a collection of seeds from gardens at Windsor Castle, symbolizing the hope that their meeting would plant new growth in Christian relationships. Their final official act was signing a joint declaration outlining areas for future cooperation. The document, carefully negotiated by theological and diplomatic experts from both traditions, identified climate action, religious freedom advocacy, and poverty alleviation as priority areas for coordinated effort. Neither church compromised its theological positions, but both committed to practical collaboration in addressing global challenges. The declaration specifically mentioned the establishment of annual Anglican Catholic summits to coordinate charitable work and advocacy efforts. It also called for joint educational programs to help both faith communities better understand their shared heritage and complementary missions. As Charles prepared for departure, Pope Francis walked with him to the courtyard where the royal motorcade waited. Their farewell was private but warm, with both men expressing gratitude for the courage each had shown in making this historic encounter possible. The Pope gave his apostolic blessing not only to the king, but to the entire British royal family and the Anglican Communion. Vatican officials later revealed that Pope Francis had been moved to tears during their private moments, overwhelmed by the spiritual significance of healing such ancient wounds. Similarly, those close to Charles reported that the king had described the experience as one of the most meaningful of his life, comparing it to his coronation in terms of spiritual impact. The international response was immediate and largely positive. Anglican bishops across the globe, praised Charles's courage in pursuing Christian unity without compromising Anglican identity. Catholic leaders worldwide celebrated the Pope's vision in extending such unprecedented hospitality to a Protestant monarch. Ecumenical organizations hailed the meeting as the most significant step toward Christian reunification since the Second Vatican Council. As night fell over Rome, both leaders spent time in private prayer and reflection. Charles, back at the British Embassy, wrote personal notes to his family and closest advisors, attempting to capture the profound emotions of a day that had exceeded all expectations. Pope Francis, in his simple Vatican apartment, updated his personal diary with reflections on what he called a day when heaven touched earth through human courage to love beyond fear. The morning after their historic encounter, King Charles III awoke in the British Embassy to a world fundamentally changed by the previous day's events. International news coverage dominated every major outlet, with headlines proclaiming everything from a new Reformation to the Great Reconciliation. Social media platforms buzzed with millions of posts sharing images, reactions, and analyses of the unprecedented royal papal meeting. Charles began his final day in Rome with a private breakfast meeting with Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, one of the Vatican's most progressive voices and a key architect of the previous day's success. Their conversation focused on practical next steps for implementing the cooperation outlined in their joint declaration. The Cardinal presented detailed proposals for establishing permanent liaison offices between Vatican City and Lambeth Palace, creating institutional frameworks for the ongoing dialogue both leaders envisioned. The ripple effects of the meeting were already becoming apparent across the Christian world. The Archbishop of Canterbury had issued a statement praising Charles's courageous leadership in demonstrating that Anglican identity is strengthened, not threatened, by meaningful engagement with our Catholic brothers and sisters. Major Protestant denominations were issuing their own responses, with most expressing cautious support while emphasizing the importance of maintaining theological distinctives. Catholic reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Cardinal Vincent Nichols, head of the Catholic Church in England and Wales, described the meeting as the answer to centuries of prayer for Christian unity. Catholic universities announced new programs in Anglican Catholic studies, while seminaries began incorporating comparative liturgical studies into their curricula. The economic implications were also becoming clear. Tourism officials in Rome reported record booking requests for Vatican tours, while British tourism authorities noted increased international interest in Anglican heritage sites. Publishers on both sides of the Atlantic rushed to produce books analyzing the theological and historical significance of the meeting. More significantly, religious communities across Britain began reaching out to one another in unprecedented ways. Catholic parishes invited Anglican congregations to join them for social action projects. Anglican churches opened their doors for interfaith dialogue sessions. The seeds of practical cooperation were already sprouting from the fertile ground prepared by their leaders' example. Charles spent his final hours in Rome visiting lesser-known religious sites, including the ancient church of Santa Sabina, where he prayed privately before a 5th-century mosaic depicting the reconciliation of Jewish and Gentile Christians. The symbolism was intentional. His pilgrimage was about healing divisions as old as Christianity itself. His departure from Rome was marked by another unprecedented gesture. Pope Francis personally accompanied Charles to the airport, an honor typically reserved for the most significant state visits. Their final conversation took place aboard the papal plane, where they exchanged personal phone numbers and committed to monthly private calls to maintain the relationship they had forged. The flight back to London gave Charles time to reflect on the magnitude of what had transpired. His private secretary briefed him on the global response, which had exceeded all expectations. World leaders from across the political and religious spectrum had issued statements of support. The Dalai Lama praised the meeting as a beautiful example of wisdom traditions learning from one another. Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks called it a model for how ancient faiths can engage modern challenges. Upon landing at Heathrow, Charles was greeted by the Archbishop of Canterbury, senior government ministers, and members of the royal family. Queen Camilla's embrace conveyed both personal pride and relief that the risky venture had succeeded beyond their boldest hopes. Prince William, as heir apparent, publicly expressed his support for his father's initiative, understanding that he would inherit both the benefits and responsibilities of this new relationship. The drive back to Windsor Castle provided glimpses of public reaction. Crowds lined the route, many holding signs expressing support for the king's courage. Anglican and Catholic clergy stood together at several points, their joint presence symbolizing the grassroots enthusiasm for continued cooperation. The first major test of the new relationship came within weeks. A terrorist attack on a Catholic church in Nigeria prompted immediate coordination between Vatican and Anglican relief organizations. The speed and effectiveness of their joint response, facilitated by communication channels established during the Rome meeting, demonstrated the practical benefits of their leaders' reconciliation. Parliamentary reaction was more complex, but ultimately supportive. While some conservative MPs raised constitutional questions, the overwhelming sentiment was pride in Britain's role as a bridge builder in an increasingly divided world. The Prime Minister announced that the government would support expanded diplomatic relations with Vatican City, including consideration of a full ambassadorial exchange. Charles established a new office within Buckingham Palace dedicated to interfaith relations, staffed by experts from multiple religious traditions. This institutional innovation ensured that the momentum from Rome would translate into sustained engagement rather than a single symbolic gesture. The first Anglican Catholic Summit, held 6 months later in Canterbury, exceeded all expectations for attendance and substantive outcomes. Bishops, theologians, and lay leaders from both traditions gathered to identify specific areas for cooperation. Working groups emerged focused on climate action, refugee assistance, religious freedom advocacy, and theological education. Personal relationships flourished as well. Charles and Pope Francis maintained their promised monthly conversations, often discussing not just official business, but personal reflections on leadership, faith, and the challenges of serving in such visible roles. Their friendship, genuine and growing, provided a model for countless other relationships forming between Anglican and Catholic communities worldwide. The meeting's impact on Charles's own reign proved transformative. His approval ratings, which had been respectable but not exceptional, soared following the Rome visit. More importantly, the king found his voice as a moral leader on global issues, speaking with new authority about the potential for faith communities to address humanity's greatest challenges. A year later, Pope Francis made a return visit to Britain, marking the first papal visit specifically requested by a British monarch. Their reunion at Westminster Abbey drew over 2 billion television viewers worldwide, cementing their partnership as one of the most significant interfaith relationships in modern history. The theological seminaries of both traditions began producing a new generation of clergy trained in ecumenical dialogue and cooperation. Young Anglicans studied Catholic social teaching, while Catholic seminarians learned Anglican approaches to biblical interpretation and liturgical practice. This intellectual cross-pollination promised to bear fruit for decades to come. Perhaps most significantly, the meeting established a new paradigm for global Christian leadership. Other Orthodox, Protestant, and Catholic leaders began seeking similar reconciliations, using the Charles Francis encounter as a template for healing ancient divisions while maintaining theological integrity. The historian who would later write the definitive account of these events concluded that the meeting represented a watershed moment in Christian history, comparable to the Council of Nicaea or the Diet of Worms in its long-term significance. The courage of two leaders to risk criticism and misunderstanding in service of a higher vision had opened possibilities that previous generations had deemed impossible. As Charles reflected on the anniversary of his Rome pilgrimage, he understood that the true measure of its success lay not in the immediate acclaim, but in the changed relationships, expanded cooperation, and renewed hope that continued to flourish. The ancient prayer, that they may all be one, had found new expression through the simple act of two faithful leaders choosing unity over division, cooperation over competition, and love over fear. The seeds planted in St. Peter's Square continued to grow, sprouting in countless parishes, communities, and individual hearts around the world, proving that even in an age of division, the human longing for reconciliation and unity remained among humanity's most powerful forces.